I've been using the Apple 27-inch 5K display since it came out in March, and at $1,600 for just the base model with the base stand, nothing fancy. Has that been worth it, or did I make a giant mistake? Ever since I left my 27-inch iMac, I've been using basically this display since that first 5K iMac was announced. I did want to purchase that 32-inch 6K XDR display, but dear God, that thing is so expensive. I've just been waiting and waiting and waiting for something like this to come out for a long, long time. In the meantime, if you remember that first review that I did on this, I talked about how I had the LG 27-inch 4K display, which was fine, but it also had a lot of issues that I wasn't really a big fan of. And in the meantime, I had a few friends actually recommend that I pick up one of these, which is the BenQ PD3220U, a 31.5-inch display at 4K instead of a 27-inch display at 5K. So when BenQ offered to send this over to just test out, obviously it was the perfect time to figure out, was I wrong in buying this, or should I have gone with my friend's recommendations actually of buying the BenQ? Now, right off the bat, the BenQ comes in currently on B&H at $1189.99, so just under $1,200. The Apple Studio display is usually $1699, and at the time of this video, it's $1599. So it's definitely a $300 to $400 plus difference between the two. Obviously, the Studio display is a 27-inch and it is a 5K display. And then the BenQ is a 31.5-inch display at 4K. And in practice, that comes down to 218 pixels per inch here, and 140 pixels per inch on the 32-inch display. You can also see pretty obviously that the Studio display is a kind of glossy finish. You have to pay more for the matte finish. And the BenQ 32-inch display here is a matte finish that helps definitely like dissipate the light so it's not just so harsh. And I will say that in my office space with my big windows, using both of them together, it was pretty interesting because I definitely got a lot less glare off of this display. But the next part we're going to talk about is the fact that the Studio display is significantly brighter, which sort of leveled the playing field between those two things. Just basing off specs, the Studio display, as you can again probably see in just the exposure of the waterfall to the dark areas here, is basically twice as bright at its maximum capacity than the BenQ here is. And the thing that I've always loved about my Apple displays, not on my iPhone, not on my iPad, but on the displays that I've gotten, I've always had very accurate colors. And the nice thing about the BenQ one is you get an actual like data readout sheet of the calibration to just know that everything is set up the way that it's supposed to be. And the nice part about that is it definitely replicates Mac colors. And when viewing the two side by side here, I didn't really have any major differences outside of, brightness and contrast. In the color replication, they were both very, very similar. In fact, I found these two displays to actually be closer in color to each other than my MacBook Pro is to either of them. So I'm not sure what that really means in all of that, but knowing that this display came calibrated specifically with that whole data sheet and everything, I would actually assume that both of them are going to be more accurate than my MacBook Pro display. In terms of just I/O, the Studio display comes with one Thunderbolt port that connects to your MacBook, as well as 3 USB Type-C 3.2 Gen 2 ports, which definitely help and give you a lot of speed and is really helpful in that way. The BenQ comes with all sorts of other ports because it's not only a Mac-only display, but it is definitely Mac compatible and it has worked fantastic. It comes with 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, 2 HDMI 2.0 ports, a display 1.4 port, one USB-C 3.2 Gen 2 port, 3 different USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 ports, as well as a 3.5 millimeter port, which is, your typical audio connection. Both supply power to the MacBook, so you don't need to use an additional charger. But one of the things that is just an added thing that you're gonna have to think about if you did decide to go for the BenQ over the Studio Display is that there is no camera built into this. So you're gonna have to use some sort of webcam or use the software to use your phone or one of those other things, use the one on your MacBook, but there just isn't a little thing built in up there. The BenQ also has significantly smaller bezels than the Studio Display. It's definitely one of those things that I kind of got used to after a little while. A huge thing about this though, is obviously it's a lot bigger, but also it can move up and down. Like look at how much higher that is. You don't have to buy a separate thing. I ended up having to buy a separate stand to stick my Studio Display on. You can just adjust it to whatever particular height works the best for you. I ended up just putting this all the way up and it ended up being the perfect space for me to use next to the Studio Display with a stand. So if you don't want to have some sort of stand in front of your computer, this makes a lot of sense and was definitely really useful. So I think ultimately, do I regret spending all of that money on the Studio Display? And should I have gone with the BenQ in the first place? Kind of where am I at? So the pros for the BenQ, it's larger. I can definitely sit a little bit further back. I didn't necessarily notice the pixel count. I wasn't ever sitting up close enough to it to notice the individual pixels. Because of a 32-inch display, you're gonna be a little bit further away and then you don't really have that much of an issue. You get a bunch of other I/O ports. So one of the things about the Studio Display that I needed to buy was a separate whole little interface, a dock of sorts to be able to plug all my other I/O into. With the BenQ, it has enough ports that I was able to just plug everything into it and be good to go. You definitely have the up and down versions of being able to raise and lower it. You also have the just fact that it came calibrated from the studio, and I have zero issues matching all of my colors and everything like that to it. Everything looks fantastic on it. And while you don't get the deep, deep, deep blacks out of here because you have the matte display, the display looks amazing. And as long as I'm not in a very, very, very bright room, I don't really notice that big of an issue. Plus, I don't really want to be editing on full blast on this thing anyway, because when you're doing that, sometimes you're just overpowering and the exposure that you're getting on something like this isn't actually accurate to what it would be normally. So most of the time I actually dim the display down on here a little bit anyway. So it is what it is. BenQ did send this to me, so that's whatever bias I might have towards it. I do clearly have an affinity towards Apple products and Apple devices. And that's just sort of my background here. Do I regret buying the Studio Display? No. It's been a great display for me. It looks great. It works with the ecosystem of Apple. It just has all the same materials, all of those kinds of things. But had I purchased this BenQ monitor before the Studio Display came out, would I have felt the need to upgrade? Definitely not. The only reason I did change from the LG display to this one was because I was just getting really inconsistent colors and I just didn't like that display very much. I would definitely say the BenQ is going to be larger, less dense of pixels, not as bright, but you have the ability to, raise and lower the display, a lot of I/O, all that kind of stuff. And conservatively, I would say that it is going to save you at least $600 because of all the extra I/O, not having to buy a stand of some sort or switch the stand to one of the upgradable ones on here. So while I'm not giving it a definitive buy this one or this one, it's one of those you can't go wrong. And I don't think that if you did purchase the BenQ one, you're going to be very disappointed because again, the biggest thing for me is color accuracy. I've had issues in the past with other monitors that were not Apple displays, and that just hasn't been the case at all with this BenQ one. So thanks again to BenQ for sending this over. I'm probably not going to put either of these up for sale or anything like that. But I might, because my office is big enough, make a couple different workstations just so I have the movability, and we'll see where we go from here. If you're interested in more, you can check out my initial review of the Apple Studio Display right here. Subscribe if you aren't already, and I will see you all on the next one.